work at the Worcester Public Library, and today I'm joined by Martha Gach. Thanks so much for joining us today, Martha.
Happy to be here.
Martha is Conservation Coordinator and Regional Education Manager at Mass Audubon's Meadow Brook Wildlife Sanctuary. A lifelong birder, she especially enjoys getting to know the birds nearby. So as the Conservation Coordinator and Regional Education Manager at Mass Audubon's Meadow Brook Wildlife Sanctuary, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Meadow Brook, maybe something that the average visitor wouldn't know?
Sure. Meadow Brook is an amazing place. I have worked here for, a long time. I don't want to really say how long. And it's the largest urban wildlife sanctuary in New England. I think it's one of Worcester's best kept secrets. And it has over 435 acres in it. Lots of different kinds of natural habitats. So forests, a power line right of way, streams and marshes and wetlands. And the diversity of the wildlife that is here is stupendous. I tell people that we have almost every kind of animal that you can expect in Massachusetts, except we haven't had any bears, and we haven't had any moose, and we don't have any porcupines. And one of the reasons for that is that, at least the moose and the porcupines, is that Meadow Brook has been shaped by fire. Up until about the 1990s, there were regular fires on the sanctuary. They were accidentally set, perhaps kids making campfires that got out of hand. And fire takes out the evergreens, the pine trees, so that when you come to Meadow Brook and visit it, you will see very few pine trees. It's mostly oaks and hickories and trees with the deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the center. And if you walk certain trails, you will see scars from that fire on the trees in the sanctuary. If you look at the base of the trunk, you'll see a little triangular scar that was left by fire licking at the base of the tree. So the fires were not wildfires like we imagine in California. They were very cool burning fires that probably moved very slowly through the sanctuary, but cleared out the underbrush, made a great environment for blueberries and other things that are fire adapted, and mean that the land has very few pine trees. So we have very few porcupines. But we do have a lot of different kinds of birds and butterflies, in part because of that fire history.
Yeah, the first time that I went to Meadow Brook, I was really excited. I saw 4 turkeys, and I passed someone on the trail and they said, "We saw a snake." And I said, "I saw turkeys." So there's definitely a lot of great animals to see there. I didn't realize about the fires though, so thanks for letting me know about that. I'll have to keep my eyes peeled. What would you say is the educational focus for Mass Audubon sanctuaries in this region?
I think the educational focus for our sanctuaries is to try, we have a couple of them. Because we're in an urban environment and there are not, people don't necessarily have experience with being out in the woods, and we are a large area. We try to educate people when they're out here visiting about the different kinds of animals and plants that they see. My personal focus is to try and educate people about ecosystems, about how all the different parts work together, the animals and the plants. We try to focus on helping people know how to look, not necessarily what they're seeing, but helping people to learn how to ask questions and try to interpret what they're seeing on the trail. So for example, if you are looking at a tree and you notice that the tree has a lot of holes in it, well, is there anything that might be making those holes? Are there any caterpillars that you can see? Are there any funny little bumps or different colors that might belong to a little insect that's living in the leaf or on the leaf? Are there spider webs that could be made by caterpillars or spiders? Just, I think the educational focus is to help people get to understand and to really see nature and what's around us, to be aware of our environment.
Yeah, that's definitely important work.
And
I
that's,
was,
and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I think that's something that you can carry that to any aspect of your life.
yeah, absolutely. And I think, as we become more hooked into the internet and computers and things like that, it can be really, unfortunately, easy to forget to get out in nature and observe things in different ways. I was wondering how you became interested in conservation and birding.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that. That's really, that's a nice thing to ask people, is about their interests. For me, it started very early on. My father used to take us kids, there were three of us and we were very young, and he would take us out into the woods and out into the streams. And it was part of his work, but the benefit is that we got to explore some really wild places, and we got to walk barefoot in the streams and turn over rocks to see what we could find, and understand that it was okay to spend a lot of time looking at a flower or watching the bees, and not to be afraid of snakes, and to listen for the deer, not just see them, but listen for noises that were around, and what those sounds could clue you into. So as a young child, I developed that sense of wonder and awe in nature, and understanding how wonderfully fascinating it can be. And then I grew up with that. When I was in college, I took a class with my friends just for something fun to do that last part of college. And it was a birding class. And we got to go out into the city park in St. Louis with somebody who knew their birds. And I learned that there were such things as warblers, these beautiful bird jewels that showed up for a few brief weeks in the springtime, and how fascinating they were, and what you could do to, how you could appreciate them. And then I put birding away for a little while. I was a biologist in school, in college, and I focused on other things, but not birds. And then when I came to Massachusetts about 20 years ago, and I found this job with Mass Audubon, it brought together all the interests and all the passion that I had for nature. I've always been involved in outdoor activities, things like Girl Scouts, for example. I've taught many young women how to camp in the woods and how to get by without running water, and sometimes without toilet paper. It's good to have those skills. And so that's always been a part of my life. And so I guess I've had it in me, but it was laid as a groundwork when I was very young. And of course, today, with all the concern about development and about climate change and everything that goes along with that, an understanding of the natural world and of conservation is critical. So it's part of my passion, I think, is to have those conversations about it, and turn people on to nature. And I want to say that even in the times that we have come through with the pandemic, people have understood just how important open space is. I think we've all seen how people are gravitating towards parks and towards open areas, and really valuing that.
Yeah, that's great that this position was able to join so many things that you love into, one occupation. And it sounds like we're really lucky at Mass Audubon that you discovered us. So That's fantastic. Since you mentioned birds and conservation, I've noticed that in recent years, there have been online events asking people who are willing to help with bird identification and reporting in their area, such as the May Birdathon. So I was wondering if you could explain the importance of these events.
Absolutely. And they don't have to be events. This is something that people can do any time, because there are ways to let other people know what you're seeing. So the Birdathon is one such event. There is another one called the Christmas Bird Count. There's another one which is the Great Backyard Bird Count that happens in February. And the importance of these events, or the importance of letting people know what birds you're encountering, is that it helps us understand how birds are moving through the world and how they're doing. For example, we know that we are missing about 30% of our birds in the past 50 years, since 1970s. Something has happened to them, and we need to understand what, so that we can support and protect them. And these events are fun opportunities for people to get together as a group and go look for birds and count birds. But it's also something that you can do on your own at any time. There is a community science database called eBird, and ebird.org, and that is open to anybody who wants to take the time to report what kinds of birds they're encountering. And it's not just the birds that you are seeing, but it can also be, if you know your bird calls, it can also be the birds that you hear, because each kind of bird has its own special voice. It's like recognizing a family member, like knowing, grandma calls and you know that it's grandma, or you know that that's your sister that's yelling at you from across the street. So if you learn to recognize those bird songs, you can use them as identification as well. So I would encourage anybody who loves birds to pay attention to the birds that you're seeing, to go visit this database and tell other people what you're seeing for birds.
I guess this ties into that 30% that you just mentioned. I was going to ask if there have been any noticeable changes in bird populations due to climate change. Do you feel that that 30% is a direct result just from climate change, or maybe from overpopulation?
That 30% is probably a lot of things put together. I'm sure that climate change has some role to play in that, because there are birds such as puffins, for example, that rely on fish of a certain size to feed their babies. And the fish are changing where they're living because the ocean temperatures are changing. And so the puffins, sorry, this is a very complicated story, but the puffins are bringing back birds that are too large for their babies to swallow. So even though the parents think that they're feeding their babies, the babies are going hungry, and many of them are not growing up to be adults. So that's one way in which climate change is impacting birds. Another thing that is impacting birds, I'm sure, are the chemicals that we're using in our environment to grow our food. There's a lot of agricultural chemicals that are being put on that weren't 50 years ago. And that is reducing the insect populations that the birds rely on also to feed their babies. And then anytime you build something, you develop a piece of wildland, you are taking away habitat that birds need to find food and to raise babies. And even things like using the beaches and overcrowding on the beaches, or running through habitat that beach nesting birds are using to raise their babies, or letting your dog run through that habitat will stress the bird and can destroy the nests. So there are lots of ways that people are impacting the bird populations, and on the same line, lots of things that we can change to support the birds.
Yeah, I didn't realize some of those stories, so thanks for sharing those examples with us. You mentioned there was an increase, in people appreciating outdoor spaces during the pandemic, and I was wondering if you were seeing that trend continue now that we're a little bit out of the woods, so to speak.
I think it's been a great trend. It's been so exciting to see so many people coming to visit and coming to be outside. And I know that it is spurring conservation efforts in towns across the Commonwealth. I believe what we're starting to see is that with the resumption of school and work and people going back into regular jobs, I don't think people have the opportunity to just get up and go the way that they did in the past year or so. So I do feel that visitation, at least here, is dropping off. But I will tell you that if the, the late in the day visitation after working hours here is still incredibly high. It's wonderful. This is a great facility, Broad Brook, and it is free to Worcester residents, as well as to Mass Audubon members and members of the Greater Worcester Land Trust. And it's a wonderful resource that city residents can and should take advantage of. And if you don't happen to be a resident of Worcester, there's a very small admission fee. It's $4 per person. I think $3 for kids. And that helps support the sanctuary and all the work that happens here to make it a safe, inviting place for people to visit and an important place for nature to be nature.
Yeah, I remember the first time I visited Broadmeadow. I just moved here maybe 2.5 years ago. I was really impressed by the size and the variety of trails. There were some that went by water and over streams, and some were steep and some were easier. And it's really just a beautiful space. So, what Martha said, you should listen to her. So for my next question, I know that for our upcoming program, you were going to share some recommendations for helpful birding books and apps. So as someone who wishes they knew more about birds and which ones were which, could you give us a little sneak peek and tell us what one of your favorite birding apps is?
My favorite birding app is iBird, and it works for me because I'm coming in already knowing a fair bit about the birds. So with that app, I can check that the colors and the patterns on the bird are what I expect them to be. And I can also push a button or click on a button and bring up the bird's song so I can listen to it. Other people that I've talked to really like Merlin, and that works for people who may not be as confident in the birds that they're seeing, and they need a little bit more help getting there.
Well, that's really neat that it's a combination of images and sound. I wouldn't have thought of that, but that sounds like a good app. So my most pressing question is, what's the most exciting bird you've seen while at Mass Audubon's Broadmeadow Brook?
Whatever bird I'm looking at is the most exciting bird because I have an opportunity to watch it and to learn from it. And I always feel like I'm eavesdropping, except when that bird is looking right at me, which they do a lot. They know that you're there. And it is the most amazing thing to be able to make a connection with a wild creature. So I really have no favorite kind of bird. It's really whatever bird I'm encountering at that very moment.
That's fair. All birds are beautiful and unique, so I'll accept that answer. If you've enjoyed this conversation with Martha as much as I have, make sure that you sign up for our program on Saturday, June 26th. It's at 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. and it is a virtual program, so you can come to this in your pajamas. And it's Mass Audubon Presents Local Birds and Birding. Martha will be there. And the event will tell us about the birds, the variety of birds in Worcester and the surrounding area. You can learn about some of the birds you could see in and around the city, along with where and how to look for them. And as Martha just commented on briefly, she'll be sharing some recommendations for helpful birding apps and books. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Martha.
It's been fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we'll see you at the birding event on June 26th.